on the member resources list is the poll observer training.
Jim Womack is leading a Zoom training session for volunteers to monitor the vote on November 5th. The 2-hour session is being conducted from a Republican Party office in Lee County, North Carolina, where Womack is the Republican Party chairman. He's instructing the volunteers on how to spot what he calls nefarious activity.
You're the eyes and ears. You're the people that can make sure that all the rules are being followed.
With less than 2 weeks to go until voters head to the polls, election officials in North Carolina tell Reuters they're concerned about training sessions like these. They say it calls for aggressive scrutiny of the voting process, which could lead to disruptions at the polls and intimidation of voters and poll workers. Voting rights advocates say it could help lay the groundwork to overturn the election if Democrat Kamala Harris wins. Voter fraud is exceedingly rare in the United States. U.S. election security officials have said the 2020 election was, quote, the most secure in American history. Despite that, Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump falsely claims the 2020 election was stolen.
Again, no long lines.
Womack, who is also the CEO of the North Carolina Election Integrity Team, or EnSite, doesn't accept the evidence that election fraud is rare.
The vast majority of the operations seeking to shape the election, or to, I should say, not shape, to exploit vulnerabilities in the law and to commit fraud in the election are coming from the left. There's no doubt about it.
Reuters observed an October 16th training session of EnSite and obtained previously unreported transcripts from EnSite planning calls. They raised the prospect of non-citizen voting. Lee County officials are adopting new safeguards to prevent poll workers from feeling intimidated. In the 2022 midterm congressional elections, North Carolina's election board registered 21 incidents regarding poll watchers, including 12 of voter intimidation and 8 of election official intimidation. Their records do not specify who trained those poll watchers. In the primaries earlier this year, Womack followed an election worker who was transporting ballot boxes to the Board of Elections office, according to an incident report viewed by Reuters. He wasn't charged with wrongdoing and says he wanted to ensure that ballots were delivered safely. He does not view his actions as intimidation. The Democratic Party plans to field its own observers at polling places, including those in Lee County. The Republican National Committee says it has trained tens of thousands of volunteer poll watchers. It says they instruct them to call an RNC hotline to report suspected irregularities. Those who do not act within the law will be dismissed, the party says on its website.
With the U.S. presidential election just a week and a half out, Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris and her Republican rival Donald Trump continued their respective campaign blitzes across swing states on Thursday. Harris held her largest political rally yet in the city of Clarkston in Georgia, one of 7 battleground states that will likely decide who wins the presidency on November 5th. Rock legend Bruce Springsteen, film director Spike Lee, and former President Barack Obama were among the high-profile Harris endorsers that took part. They, along with Harris, urged the crowd of some 20,000 to take advantage of early voting and to reject Trump.
What I cannot understand is why anybody would think that Donald Trump will shake things up in a way that is good for you, because there is absolutely no evidence that this man thinks about anybody but himself.
After an initial bump in the polls after launching her campaign in late July, Harris's lead has since evaporated in key swing states. The latest polls in Georgia now show Trump with a slight lead, but Harris campaign officials say they remain confident the state is still in play. Thursday's rally represented the latest attempt by her campaign to capitalize on the backing of celebrities to mobilize voters in the closing days of a tight election race. On Friday, she is set to appear with Beyoncé in Houston. Meanwhile, Trump on Thursday evening held a rally on the Arizona State University campus in Tempe, Arizona. Maricopa County, where Tempe is located, narrowly went for Biden over Trump in the 2020 election and remains one of the fiercest battlegrounds in the country.
What she's done and he's done, Crooked Joe and Kamala, what a combination. Worst combination in the history of our country.
Trump took shots at his customary list of targets, criticizing Biden and Harris's competence. He also made false claims about immigrants and a spike in violent crime. Studies show immigrants are not more likely to engage in criminality.
And we will put these vicious and bloodthirsty criminals in jail, or we'll kick them the hell out of our country as fast as we can.
More than 30 million voters have already cast their ballots as of Thursday evening, according to tracking data from the election lab at the University of Florida. More than 13 million of those votes were in person, with more than 17 million by mail-in ballot, according to the data.
Feeling stressed about the upcoming election? You're not alone. An American Psychological Association poll taken earlier this year found that 65% of U.S. adults felt exhausted by politics, while 55% felt angry.
You hear so much on both sides nonstop, like it's the end of democracy.
Two different characters, outlook on life. It's just a crazy world.
He is only focused on himself.
She's a low IQ individual.
This is therapist Laura Goldstein.
It's stress, it's anxiety, it's fear, it can sometimes be anger or outrage.
She says the election has increasingly come up during client sessions.
I think one of the other big things that we're seeing a lot of is people struggling to connect because it doesn't always feel safe to talk about. You don't know what environments are a safe environment to have political conversations or to discharge some of the stress.
Carrie Jarvie is a mental health counselor.
Yeah, if someone's experiencing stress leading up to this election cycle, it starts with reflecting on what is my level of media consumption? Has it reached the point where it's not helpful anymore?
He says people suffering from election anxiety should seek activities that decrease interaction from the media.
What are the things that make you feel like yourself?
Like surfing or going on a trail.
Election-wise, yeah, no one talks election.
This is a good release to be out in nature.
In 2020, media outlets weren't able to declare the winner for 4 days after the election. And this year, we expect it's going to take even longer. Polls are showing that this is likely to be one of the closest elections in U.S. history between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. There are 7 states that are considered battlegrounds. Every single one of those states is essentially tied, according to the polls, with very small margins in one direction or the other. There are a lot of people who vote by mail. That's a trend that's accelerated since the pandemic. In Pennsylvania, the most important swing state by consensus, almost 2 million voters have requested mail ballots. And mail ballots take longer to count. In a couple of the swing states, particularly Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, state law doesn't allow election officials to touch those votes until Election Day. So once Election Day comes, that's when they start checking the envelopes to make sure that they've been properly sealed, checking signatures to make sure that they match what's on file, making sure that the voter's name matches registration. And only after they've done all of those things, all of which takes time, can they then finally tabulate those ballots and add them to the count. Even in states like Arizona and Nevada, where workers are allowed to start processing and tabulating mail ballots before Election Day occurs, it still takes a really long time just because of the sheer volume. So in both those states, a majority of voters vote by mail. So because of a host of reasons, the historic closeness of the election, the number of mail ballots that voters are using to cast their votes, and the different procedures that these various battleground states use to tabulate those votes after Election Day, all of those are going to contribute to what's going to be a long time before we can actually say who won this election.
Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party may lose its dominance after Sunday's parliamentary election, throwing the country into uncertainty in the face of growing tensions with China and rising inflation. The conservative LDP has been in government for almost all of Japan's post-war era, and since 2012 has a majority in the lower house of parliament. It rules in coalition with a smaller party called Komeito, which it depends on to control the less powerful upper house. That could change, as an opinion poll in the Asahi Shimbun Monday suggests. The party could lose as many as 50 of its 247 seats in the lower chamber. The poll says Komeito could slip to fewer than 30 seats, putting the coalition below the 233 needed for a majority. Another poll by public broadcaster NHK Monday found support for Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba's cabinet dropped to 41% from 44% a week ago. It may be explained in part by public anger the LDP faces over a political funding scandal and the rising cost of living in Japan. And Jeffrey Hall, a lecturer at the Kanda Institute of International Studies in Tokyo, says voters aren't convinced by Ishiba's half measures to reform the party.
The LDP hasn't really done much to deal with the scandals. They've self-investigated, issued very weak punishments on their own members. This would be a major blow to Prime Minister Ishiba, who's been trying to tell the public that he's trying to restore trust in the LDP, reform his party. He'll be considerably weakened as a leader. His party will be weakened in the policies that it particularly wants to focus on, because bringing in a coalition partner will cause them to have to make certain compromises with that party, whatever party it may be.
The LDP will need at least one other partner if it loses its majority. That may include the Democratic Party for the People, which had 7 lower house lawmakers going into the election and advocates for lower taxes. There's also the Conservative Japan Innovation Party, which is defending 44 seats with a pledge of tougher donation rules to clean up politics. But those would mean policy clashes, such as the DPP wanting to halve Japan's 10% national sales tax and cut income tax, which his party does not support. And it could complicate the Bank of Japan's efforts to unwind decades of monetary stimulus. While the LDP easily remains the biggest force in parliament, many votes could go to the second largest party, the opposition Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan, which once toppled the LDP in 2009. The center-left CDPJ could try to cobble together an administration from a patchwork of opposition parties. But experts say it would be very challenging because their views don't align with many opposition parties, and that regardless of who wins, Japan likely faces political instability ahead.
This is the aftermath of a deadly Israeli strike on a school in Gaza Thursday. More than a dozen people were killed, including children, according to a local hospital. It was where people displaced by the fighting were sheltering. This eyewitness says he heard the strike. He says the people coming out of the building were, quote, all cut up, arms and legs separate. The Israeli military said it had hit a Hamas command and control center embedded in a former school. There had been hopes that the killing of Hamas's leader Yahya Sinwar last week might provide an opening to end the fighting. But Israel is pushing on with intensive operations in northern Gaza. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Middle East this week in hopes of reviving ceasefire talks. He was in Doha Thursday and spoke at a news conference with Qatar's Prime Minister.
We had an opportunity today to talk about the way forward on the effort to bring the hostages home and to get a ceasefire. Partly this involves an assessment of exactly where Hamas stands in the wake of the death of Sinwar. We talked about that. We talked about options to capitalize on this moment and next steps to move the process forward. And I anticipate that our negotiators will be getting together in the coming days.
As the war moves into its second year, the death toll from the Israeli campaign in Gaza is approaching 43,000. Israel launched its campaign in retaliation for the Hamas-led attack on Israel last year, which killed some 1,200 people and saw more than 250 hostages taken to Gaza. It has said it will continue until Hamas is dismantled completely and the hostages return.
A new UN report warns that the world faces catastrophic climate consequences under current policies. It says the world is on a path to warm more than 3 degrees Celsius, or 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit, by the end of the century. That's double the 1.5 degrees Celsius cap that countries agreed to in Paris nearly a decade ago. Here's UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
We are teetering on a planetary tightrope. The emissions gap is not an abstract notion. There is a direct link between increasing emissions and increasingly frequent and intense climate disasters.
The UN's annual emissions gap report takes stock of countries' promises to tackle climate change, compared with what's needed. It suggests nations must collectively cut emissions by about half in the coming decade, a target seen as likely out of reach. The world has currently warmed by about 1.3 degrees. At next month's annual UN Climate Summit in Azerbaijan, countries will work to build on an agreement made last year to transition away from fossil fuels. Summit negotiations will help inform individual countries' emissions-cutting strategies, which are due in February.